Though you might have anticipated this storm, its actual arrival still catches you off guard. The royal foundations did not tremble because of some loud public controversy. Instead, they fractured when Princess Anne finally chose to speak aloud a dark truth that had been kept in the shadows since the final hours of Queen Elizabeth. A single statement completely chilled the atmosphere inside the palace walls. The late ruler had left a strict private message: Camilla must never mistake her marriage to the monarch for actual royal power. Before we dissect the massive fallout of this revelation, make sure to follow this channel to stay informed on every major development. Anne timed her intervention with absolute precision. She avoided casual leaks or passing comments, opting instead to present a formal, documented report at an exclusive family gathering at Windsor. This was a written testimony she defended directly in front of Charles, Camilla, and William. Windsor served as the perfect backdrop because it represents the ultimate sanctuary of the dynasty, a place where private conflicts are settled away from public eyes, and where a heavy silence speaks louder than any press release. But why did she wait until now to drop this bomb? The answer lies in the fragile boundary between affection and authority. Charles stared at his sister as if the ground beneath his feet had cracked open. Suddenly, the crown's innermost privilege, the absolute power to oversee royal archives, state briefings, and crucial sovereign choices, was the only thing that mattered. He knew exactly why those words cut so deep. They did not attack his partner, they questioned whether his private affections had compromised his public duty. That is the core of the dilemma, placing him right between the queen consort and the ghost of his mother, whose final ruling still echoes through these halls. Camilla remained perfectly still, refusing to show vulnerability or seek reassurance. She listened as Anne explained that while the late queen supported her public status, she deeply feared a future where marital influence could dictate crown policy. That sharp distinction hurts far more than mere anger because it proves the late monarch separated public acceptance from sovereign trust, companionship from actual leadership, and a marriage from the state apparatus. Camilla's quietness made it clear she understood this boundary. William observed the scene with a cold, unreadable expression, yet his tense posture betrayed his thoughts. For years, the young prince suspected his grandmother had set invisible boundaries around the crown, but he had never heard them articulated with such devastating clarity. And pressed on, revealing that the legendary monarch delivered this verdict right before her passing, during a highly private conversation with no staff present to witness or soften the blow. This was not a personal grudge, it was a matter of state survival. Yet, as the family absorbed the shock, they realized they were already living inside the exact disaster the queen had predicted. A royal warning always hits everyone differently. For Charles, it was a legacy shattered. For Camilla, it was a path blocked. For Anne, it was a heavy duty finally paid. And for William, it was proof that the dynasty's future was shaped by a secret anxiety his grandmother took to her grave. Charles stood there, unable to dismiss his mother's final words as mere history. They had entered his own era like a royal command that refused to be buried. He was no longer just a son mourning his mother, he was the king, and that made the entire situation highly volatile. To ignore the message would mean placing his wife above the sacred judgment of Queen Elizabeth. But to enforce it would mean stripping Camilla of the security she had spent decades building. And did not rush to break the silence, which only made her presence more formidable. She has never relied on dramatic outbursts, her influence comes from her quiet discipline. The documented report she brought to the table was not for show, it was a declaration that silence had become too dangerous. When she pointed out that the late queen separated marital inclusion from crown authority, the truth pierced the room. Crown authority is the silent engine of the monarchy, access to confidential state papers, private diaries, and the official decisions that prevent the state from becoming a personal playground. Camilla met this cold reality with a quietness that was louder than any scream. She was not being accused of treason, which somehow made the truth even more painful. Anne's words pointed to a deeper, more agonizing reality. Queen Elizabeth accepted Camilla at her son's side, but feared her hand on the steering wheel. Camilla had survived public hatred, but surviving the quiet disapproval of the ultimate sovereign was a different battle. William felt his resolve harden. Watching the scene unfold, he remembered how quickly boundaries began to blur after his grandmother passed, how informal privilege slowly became an expectation, and how expectation began to look like an entitlement. He remained silent, but his silence told his father that the next king had already chosen his side of the line. Charles eventually asked if anyone else could verify this conversation. Anne's brief hesitation before replying was an answer in itself. Then, she brought up the exact moment that convinced the Queen that the crown was in danger. A single breach of trust had set this entire tragedy in motion. Every great family split has one specific moment everyone remembers differently. To some, it was just a simple mistake. To others, it was the exact second the old queen saw the crown's future slipping away. And referred to it as the Windsor folder incident, a quiet afternoon when a highly confidential state portfolio meant solely for the sovereign's eyes was moved, questioned, and nearly opened by the wrong office. And did not describe a scene of panic, which made it even more terrifying. She described a quiet, calculated atmosphere where the greatest dangers always hide. The Windsor folder was not just a collection of papers, it was a highly sensitive organizational briefing prepared exclusively for the monarch, detailing future limitations on family authority and access. It had been compiled for Queen Elizabeth during a quiet period at Windsor, yet somehow, it found its way toward Camilla's desk before the Queen had even reviewed it. Elizabeth noticed the discrepancy instantly. Though physically weak, her mind remained as sharp as that of any sovereign who has spent a lifetime reading between the lines. She asked one simple question: "Where is the folder?" The room went completely cold. No one dared answer because any explanation was dangerous. If it was a mistake, it showed incompetence; if it was intentional, it showed something far worse. And watched her mother's expression shift, not to anger, but to a quiet, deep alarm. The folder dealt with sovereign access and household authority. These details matter because they dictate who sees the state's secrets, who shapes the king's decisions, and who stands close enough to power to be mistaken for power itself. Elizabeth believed these lines must remain strictly within the royal bloodline. That very night, the Queen called and to her side. She spoke not as a mother caught in family drama, but as a sovereign defending her kingdom. The crown can survive scandals, she warned. It can survive rivalries, embarrassment, and pain. But it cannot survive confusion over who actually rules. And understood the gravity of those words immediately. The warning was born that night. Camilla's name was not spoken as an accusation, but as a deep-seated fear that closeness to the king would eventually be mistaken for authority over the throne. And had kept this secret out of loyalty to her living mother, but after the funeral, she saw the old patterns returning. Now that the secret was out, the polite masks had to come off, leading to the confrontation they all tried to avoid. The confrontation did not start with shouting, it began with the heavy sound of a door locking. No advisors, no secretaries, no protective shield of courtiers. Just Charles, and Camilla, and William in a Windsor office where old loyalties had suddenly become liabilities. And kept her voice perfectly calm. She placed her hands firmly on the table, forcing her brother to look at their mother's warning without looking away. Charles demanded explanations, but his voice was thick with betrayal. He wanted to know why Anne had kept this secret for so long, allowing him to step into his reign without knowing his mother had drawn a line he was never supposed to cross. Windsor was no longer just a family home, it was a battlefield where private grief collided with the survival of the crown. Anne did not back down. She had stayed silent because their mother was still alive, and preserving her peace mattered more than starting a war. But with the Queen gone, silence was no longer peace, it was a risk to the institution itself. And told Charles she had protected their mother's peace during her life, and now she was protecting the crown after her death. Camilla sat opposite her, holding onto her composure like a shield, though the blow had clearly landed. She had faced public insults before, But this was different because it carried the absolute weight of Queen Elizabeth's ghost. She finally asked the one question no one else had the courage to voice: did she name me? The room seemed to shrink. Anne looked her straight in the eyes and replied with icy calm, she named the danger. And then she named you. Only then did William speak. He had stayed on the edge of the room, listening as a son, a grandson, and the future king. When he spoke, there was no joy in his voice. He told Charles that the fairness of the warning no longer mattered. What mattered was whether the crown could survive ignoring it. Fairness is a luxury for families, but authority is the lifeblood of a monarchy. Once those lines are blurred, power looks taken rather than inherited. Charles offered no reply. He looked away from Anne, then from Camilla, and finally from William, as if each face represented a different, conflicting duty. The king walked out of the room without healing the wound he had just opened. But everyone knew one thing: emotions had failed to solve the crisis, leaving a much colder question behind. Who actually held the keys to the boundaries the queen had left behind? Power in a monarchy is rarely loud. It lives in restricted guest lists, private seals, locked offices, and names written on documents that almost no one ever reads. After Anne's revelation, the issue was no longer Camilla's hurt feelings, it was whether the late queen's boundaries still held any power, and who had the strength to enforce them. Anne knew that emotional arguments would fade. Charles could dispute memories, resist the pain, and convince himself that his mother's mind was clouded by age or the exhaustion of her final days. But he could not argue with the official access memorandum Anne laid on the table. This memorandum was a highly restricted palace document outlining exactly who was permitted to view sensitive state files, enter private archives, or receive confidential crown briefings. It mattered because a monarchy survives not through crowns and gold, but through the absolute control of what remains hidden. Charles read the document in silence, his anger slowly turning into cold reality. His fingers paused over his mother's handwritten initials, and suddenly, the paper was no longer a cold piece of bureaucracy, it was his mother's final command. The king had entered the room defensive, but the words before him left no room for outrage. They proved that the late queen had systematically secured these boundaries before her death, ensuring that the core of sovereign power remained strictly within the direct bloodline. And watched her brother process the truth, feeling the heavy cost of her actions. She had not only challenged Camilla's influence, she had reopened her brother's deepest grief. Every sentence reminded him that Elizabeth did not fear a person, she feared chaos. The private diaries, state registers, and confidential briefings were not ordinary papers. State registers dictate who is allowed to stand where, who gets access first, and who holds precedence during state affairs. Whoever controls these details controls the narrative of power. William finally saw the grand design. And was not acting out of jealousy, she was defending a system their grandmother had built in secret to protect the throne from becoming a family business. Camilla's public dignity remained untouched, but the memorandum made one truth impossible to deny: standing beside the king does not mean holding the power of the king. Then came the first real blow. A formal notice was delivered to Camilla's office, polite in its phrasing but devastating in its execution. One major privilege was being revoked immediately. When that notice arrived, the old warning officially became her new reality. The first thing she lost was not a grand title, a historic jewel, or a seat in a royal carriage. It was access. A quiet directive, issued deep within the palace, informed Camilla that certain sensitive state papers that usually passed through her office would now be routed elsewhere. No public drama was needed, the quietness of the move made it far more brutal. For the first time, the Queen's warning was treated as a direct order. Camilla received the news with a cold stillness. Her staff would no longer have early access to key sovereign briefings linked to Queen Elizabeth's private files. Sovereign briefings are highly classified updates prepared only for the monarch and direct bloodline heirs, dealing with sensitive family matters and state authority. They matter because they dictate who knows the future first, and in the royal world, knowledge is the ultimate currency of power. Charles understood the full impact of this move before anyone could explain it to him. The decision was framed carefully, not as a public humiliation, but as a return to the boundaries his mother had established. That precise framing made it impossible to fight. If the king tried to overturn it, he would not just be defending his wife, he would be actively defying the final wishes of Queen Elizabeth, a move no husband's love could justify. Camilla sat alone in her room, her hand resting on her chair as the quiet humiliation sank in. She had not been publicly disgraced or named in a brutal press release, yet the private nature of the exclusion made it cut even deeper. It proved the family did not need a public scandal to strip her of her influence, they only had to close one quiet door. Suddenly, the vast distance between her and the true power of the crown was impossible to ignore. Charles wanted to comfort her, but he hesitated. He knew that any promise to reverse the decision would put him in direct conflict with William, and the legacy of his mother. He was trapped between his love for his wife and his duty to his crown. And that silent paralysis was the most telling moment of all. Anne's warning began altering the palace instantly. Courtiers stopped sending key memos through informal routes. William instructed his team that all matters regarding Queen Elizabeth's legacy must go through verified channels only, meaning routes controlled strictly by those responsible for protecting the late monarch's legacy, free from casual family influence. The shift was quiet, but it was total. Camilla's pain created the very crisis Charles had tried to avoid. He could no longer hide behind protocol, he had to choose between defending his wife or honoring his mother's final command. This choice led to the quietest, most private conversation of their entire lives. When the grand machinery of the palace stopped turning, only the marriage remained. Charles found Camilla in a private sitting room where no advisors could soften the blow. There were no speeches, no royal protocols, just a husband facing a wife who felt judged by a deceased queen, and a king realizing that even the greatest love cannot override a sovereign boundary. Charles entered the room carrying the weight of two conflicting loyalties, and neither offered any comfort. He had faced hostile councils and public storms, but this quiet room was far more dangerous. Camilla was not asking about titles or seating arrangements, she was asking if the woman whose approval had defined their entire lives had ever truly trusted her. That question mattered because trust in a monarchy is never just personal, it is the foundation of authority. Camilla did not hide her pain behind anger for long. She wanted Charles to tell her that his mother was wrong, that Anne had twisted the truth, and that the warning was just the product of a tired, aging mind. But the king could not give her that lie. A sovereign boundary is a sacred line around the crown's private authority, dictating who enters the inner circle and who must remain outside. Charles knew that if he dismissed it as mere family bickering, he would weaken the very throne his mother had defended for 70 years. Charles admitted the warning broke his heart because it felt like a final judgment on the life they had fought so hard to build. He had waited decades for her to stand by his side without shame, without whispers, and without the shadows of the past. Now, his mother's final command had turned that hard-won victory into something incredibly fragile. It did not end their marriage, but it drew a sharp line around it, cutting right through both of them. Camilla's anger slowly dissolved into a quiet sadness. She realized the warning was not a rejection of her as his wife, but a strict limit on how far her influence could reach. She could be loved, honored, and respected in public, but Queen Elizabeth had drawn a permanent distinction between being loved by the king and holding power over his kingdom. Charles finally told her the boundary would stand, not because of Anne or William, but because his mother's final command had to be respected. Camilla listened, deeply hurt, but she stopped fighting. She quietly agreed not to challenge the restrictions, a single choice that prevented a private family crisis from becoming a public disaster. But while the palace was quiet, the world outside was about to explode. By morning, the secret Anne had guarded for so long belonged to the entire nation. The public did not see this as a minor palace disagreement, they saw it as Queen Elizabeth speaking from beyond the grave. By sunrise, the entire country was looking at one front-page image, Anne's stern, uncompromising face next to Camilla's downcast eyes, under the headline, "The Queen's Final Warning." Suddenly, a private family matter became a national judgment. Britain woke up to a story that felt less like gossip and more like an unfulfilled royal command. Anne's revelation had escaped the walls of Windsor and entered every home, every phone screen, and every conversation about what the monarchy was becoming. The warning was so powerful because it did not accuse Camilla of a cheap scandal, it raised a far more serious question. Had the late Queen feared that the very boundaries of royal authority were crumbling within her own family? Palace officials moved quickly, but their statements were carefully neutral, neither denying the emotional truth of Anne's account nor confirming the details. They simply insisted that family matters should remain private, a restraint that spoke volumes. A palace response is designed to prevent panic and control the narrative, but this one had to perform a miracle: protect Camilla from total humiliation without looking like it was dismissing the late Queen's final wishes. Outside the palace gates, the atmosphere grew solemn. Crowds gathered in silence, some bringing flowers for the late Queen, as if this revelation had reopened the country's grief. People were not talking about politics, they were talking about trust. They talked about Anne's loyalty, Charles's agonizing dilemma, and the ghost of the Queen that still ruled the house. Then, a prominent broadcaster framed the entire crisis in a single sentence: "This is not a rebellion against Camilla, it is the restoration of Elizabeth's final line." That phrase settled over the country with absolute force, changing the meaning of the entire drama. Anne was no longer a sister attacking the Queen consort, she was a loyal daughter delivering a message no one else was strong enough to carry. William's reputation rose alongside hers. The public saw him not as a rival to his father, but as the guardian of his grandmother's legacy, a future king protecting the throne before it could drift too far from its foundations. Charles appeared increasingly isolated, not weak, but deeply wounded by the impossible choice between his wife and his legacy. Camilla maintained her public composure, but the silence around her had shifted. The crown had to do more than just survive the story, it had to resolve it before the warning permanently defined his entire reign. Because in the end, the warning was not just about Camilla, it was a verdict on the survival of the crown itself. In the final reckoning, the warning did not break the family, it simply forced them to face the line they had all been too afraid to name. Queen Elizabeth's final command forced Charles to accept that while love can stand beside duty, it can never stand above it. Anne's revelation had wounded, clarified, and ultimately settled the matter. Camilla remained queen consort, but the inner authority of the crown stayed exactly where Elizabeth had intended. Charles accepted the terms with the quiet grief of a son who finally understood his mother's last boundary. Camilla's public role would still be respected, and she would continue to stand by his side in the life they had built together, but her access to Queen Elizabeth's private papers remained permanently blocked. Private sovereign materials are the holy grail of the monarchy: the late Queen's personal diaries, state files, and restricted decisions. Whoever holds these files does not just read history, they shape the future of the throne. Anne's revelation, delivered through the document she had preserved so carefully, was no longer viewed as an act of family betrayal, it was recognized as an act of absolute protection. She had not spoken to hurt Camilla or weaken her brother, she spoke because boundaries mean nothing if no one has the courage to defend them. And carried the personal cost of this battle without any sense of triumph. She had waited, watched, and finally spoken only when silence became a danger to the crown itself. Camilla accepted the painful reality because she knew that fighting it would destroy the monarchy. She could remain loved by Charles and respected by the public, but her place at his side did not give her power over the institution. That truth was painful because it separated personal victory from royal trust. She had won his heart, but the crown had reminded her that closeness is not command. William emerged from the crisis with immense authority, not by taking power from his father, but by standing firmly behind his grandmother's principles. He did not need to raise his voice, his strength came from his absolute refusal to let grief, marriage, or family pressure erase the lines Elizabeth had drawn. Charles privately acknowledged the deepest wound of all: his mother's warning was so painful because it was absolutely correct, demanding that he be a king before he was a husband. The dynasty chose continuity over comfort. Queen Elizabeth's warning did not destroy Camilla, weaken Charles, or divide the family beyond repair. It simply clarified the ultimate rule of the throne. Affection may enter the palace, but only duty can govern it. The story ends with one undeniable truth: Anne's revelation did not break the crown, it reminded everyone exactly who the crown was built to serve. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.